Hello, everyone. Welcome to NCSL's webinar, Power of Podcasting. My name is Gene Rose, and I'll be moderating our webinar today. I am a former communications director at the National Conference of State Legislatures, a former communications director for the Missouri House of Representatives, and now president of my company, At Last Communications. Today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. Over the next 60 minutes, we encourage participation through our chat box, so feel free to type your questions at any time in the chat box, which is in the lower right hand of your screen. To begin building some comfort with the chat function and to also learn who is on the line today, I invite you to type in the state which you work from in that chat box right now. So while I continue, just let us know where you're from. I want to also briefly mention the resources. Above the presentation, you'll see a couple of tabs, one of them labeled Resources. Here you can find and download a PDF version of the PowerPoint, as well as some other handouts that have been prepared specifically for this presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCSL's website within the week. So we see some people saying where they're from, and looks like we are represented very well coast to coast. So thank you for your responses, and let's begin our webinar today. So our presenters today are me, and you've heard enough about me right now, but we're also very grateful to have Richard Lee, a staff writer from the Texas Senate, joining us, and Ty Liddell, an audio engineer from the Texas Senate as well. So we're glad you practiced on that chat box. We have a poll question for you right now that we want to find out, kind of read the room and see what your interest level is in producing podcasts. So we're going to ask you to answer the question, which statement most closely matches your interest in today's webinar? And we have 5 choices for you. One is my legislature is considering producing a podcast. My legislative chamber is considering producing a podcast. My caucus is considering producing a podcast. I am considering producing an individual podcast, and I'm just curious. So please answer your, provide us some feedback with those answers right now. We'll wait just a few seconds here and see where we're coming in. So it looks like more than half the people are just curious here today, but we do have about 25% are saying that they are considering producing an individual podcast, 10% saying their caucus is interested in producing a podcast, and about 15% saying the legislature is interested in producing a podcast. So thank you for your responses on that. So let's talk about podcasts and why it now might be a good time for you to consider doing one. Podcasts are the new blogs, according to, you see some resources down there at the bottom right, Innovation Hosting. They say that the reason that podcasts are kind of a perfect medium right now is that they are the new blogs. And they note the rise of the smartphone has really helped propel, and I'll show you a chart here in a second, the popularity of the podcast. It's an easy access media. There's a podcast for every niche, and it fits emerging technology. And just using Alexa or Google Home as those type of things where you can actually produce podcasts or information that can be broadcast on those type of devices. So this chart shows that how smartphones really have driven podcast usage. And you can see just since 2014 that there's been a dramatic rise, 157% increase in people using their own smartphones just to listen to podcasts. And I have to tell you, just 2 nights ago, my 23-year-old daughter, who has been a music lover her entire life, now says that she prefers podcast over music, that she's wasting time if she's listening to music. There's such good podcasts and information out there. So I thought that was a very, very telling anecdote. So Edison research tells us that 64% or 180 million U.S. residents are aware of the term podcasting, and that's up from 15% 3 years ago. 44% listen to podcasts, and that's up from 33% 3 years ago. 26 or 73 million report listening to podcasts monthly, and that's up from 17% just, again, 3 years ago. So you can see that the timing is right. It's important to know where people are listening to their where they're listening to their podcast, and at home, nearly 50% of the people, that's where they are listening to their podcasts, and the next highest one is in their vehicles. So this is something to keep in mind when you are considering producing a podcast, where people might be listening to them and what kind of environment that they will be around when they are listening. So there's an estimated 550,000 podcasts in circulation right now, featuring 18.5 million episodes. So you might think that's overwhelming. How do people decide what they want to listen to? But if you go back to that niche statement earlier, people are looking for niches. They're looking for information specifically for them. And I will argue today that legislatures are an open topic in terms of what is needed out there. This website called Player FM does a pretty good job of categorizing podcasts around the country, and they do have a legislatures tab, and we're grateful that they put our American states on their list here. But as you scroll through that, if you go online and find out what they are showing, you will see that there aren't many podcasts really out there in state legislatures. We know that there are a few states, a few individual legislators that are podcasting, but by and large, legislatures or caucuses are not really taking advantage of this technology right now. So, should I podcast? I got a little checklist here, and I can't stress enough that the most important question you have to answer is, how does this fit your communication strategy? You shouldn't do it just for the sake of doing it. But the benefit that it gives you is that it's another tool to reach people that you might not normally reach. The way people get their news today is much different than it was just 5 years ago. The market is segmented, so it's important to consider this when you consider whether this is going to help you build your brand or not. But know that it's going to take time, depending on the style of podcast and how long you want it to be, and we'll cover that subject here in a minute. It could take you anywhere from 30 minutes to 5 hours to produce, so you need to make sure that you have that capacity. And you have to put episodes out on a regular basis, or people will not follow you. You'll have to have a marketing plan, which is knowing who your audience is, and perhaps more importantly, how will you measure your success? Is it okay if 50 people, 50 very targeted people are listening? Do you need 2,000? Know what you want to accomplish from the get-go. Comedian Mark Maron has, I think, a perfect line here. It's not difficult to produce a podcast, but it's hard getting people to listen. He's got one of the top 200 podcasts consistently, but he makes a very strong point here that if you don't have interesting content, you're probably not going to get people to listen. So what makes a good podcast? It's content that is relevant and insightful, and it fits your audience's needs. It has to be authentic. People don't want to listen to something that they know is blatantly biased. They want something that's authentic. They love stories. You're probably very familiar with the podcast Serial and a few others like that have really taken a moving story and really made it very compelling for people to listen to. You also want to listen to your feedback, and you have to have interesting guests. You have to have guests that people really want to spend time with and want to learn from. So if the answer to number one, if you should podcast, is yes, then there are certain things that you know that you have to do right away. You need to establish a name for the podcast, complete with key relevant words to match online searches. You need to have royalty-free music for your introduction at the end of the podcast, and create high-resolution artwork to appear on your iTunes and other sources, such as your web page, and we'll show you our American States logo here in just a second. You also need to develop a web page where you can have these episodes available to people to download. This could be part of your legislative chamber's website, but you need to get a redirect URL that is short and memorable. You need to get the podcast listed on iTunes, Google Play, and other resources to set up a subscription method on your web page. And again, I can't say it enough, you need to develop a marketing plan for your podcast. So let's talk about the Our American States model a little bit. We note that we are on we just produced our 50th episode last week. Longevity helps build an audience, and we try to produce 2 to 3 podcasts per month for that consistency and provide information that we believe is useful to state legislative staff and legislators. And I should note that this is Legislative Staff Week here at NCSL, and we're glad to see a lot of legislative staff participating in this today. So one of the things we have to determine is how long each episode is. A resource called Audacity to Podcast recommends 15 to 60 minutes for a weekly podcast, 60 minutes for a podcast twice a month, and 60 to 90 minutes if you publish monthly. Now, those are just kind of guidelines. I mentioned that we have decided here that 20 to 30 minutes is our kind of sweet spot because of the research that we have done that shows that legislators and legislative staff tend to listen to these on their way to work, or it's something that they can listen to at work without taking up too much of the day. So how often you publish is very, very important, but again, you need to make sure that it is consistent. So determine what kind of content you want to provide your audience. Decide, is it going to be policy-based? Is it politically based? Is it news-based? Is it educational, perhaps about representative democracy or civic education? Or is it a combination? What makes good content is something that is engaging for the audience and you have determined that you want to reach. And I can't emphasize the word engaging enough. You have to make it something that they look forward to. And part of that content has to be driven by your style. I will be the first to say that Our American States may not be the classic definition of a podcast. Podcasts are generally thought of as very conversational between two people, but ours is more of an interview style. And what we want to do is make sure that our guests provide as much information as they can without me getting in the way of that. So your podcast could be 2 people talking to each other and produced in a studio that really cuts down on your editing time, but you may want to be more like Our American States, where policy or newsmakers are featured. Much of this will be determined by the type of podcast you can produce, whether it's just in a studio environment, whether you want to use phone interviews like we do, or do field interviews, or to be able to do a combination of these types. So with that said, on Our American States, I want to turn this over to Richard Lee with the Texas Senate to talk about what they are doing in Texas now and where they see their content going in the future. Richard?
All right, thanks, Gene. Hi, everybody. My name's Richard Lee. I've been making podcasts since before iPods were invented, and we called them radio actualities. But in that time, there's been quite an evolution in both the radio market and obviously the podcasting market. So I'm going to start off by playing you a sample of what we do, and then I'm going to describe our content, our editorial process, and things like that. So here we go. This one is from March 2017, after we passed our state budget. From the state capitol in Austin, this is the Texas Senate Weekly Podcast. I'm Richard Lee. 3 key pieces of legislation cleared the Senate this week. One is the state budget, the most important bill that must pass the legislature every session. Another bill would modify the state's voter ID law, and the third would create a new school choice program that allows the use of public funds for private school tuition. First, the budget. Throughout the session, Finance Committee Chair and lead Senate budget writer Jay Nelson of Flower Mound has stressed the need for stretching every dollar as the state has faced a revenue downturn brought about by low oil prices. The budget proposal presented before the Senate on Tuesday accomplishes that, she said, but still funds the state's critical priorities.
This is a lean budget, but it's also a smart budget. It responsibly meets the needs of our state, and it preserves our principles of fiscal responsibility that have guided us through tough budgets in the past, and I believe it helps us come out stronger on the other side.
The budget passed unanimously by the Senate on Tuesday would spend $106.4 billion in general revenue over the next 2 years. It fully funds the state share of public education and continues emergency funding approved over the interim to fix the state's beleaguered child protection and foster care systems. There were some cuts, however. Public universities will see between a 6 and 10% reduction next biennium due to reforms in what is called special items funding. Amarillo Senator and Higher Education Committee Chair Kel Seliger led a Finance Committee work group that looked at these special items.
They were intended to fund certain things, certain programs, certain innovations, some of them going back all the way to 1909, growing in 2016 to $1.1 billion, and they never went away.
The Senate budget would take $1.4 billion spent on special items in 2015 and replace it with $700 million through the standard formulas that determine university funding levels. Additional savings in the bill were found by a committee work group assigned to identify ways to streamline state health care spending. The next step for the budget is reconciliation with the House version. 5 members from each chamber will form a conference committee that will decide.
That actually goes on for another few minutes. I think the total length of that one is 6 minutes, but I just wanted to give you an example of how it sounds and how our integrated actualities, the actual clips of members speaking, sounded. Those clips were taken right off of our web feed, our broadcasting feed. Once we switched to high-quality streaming, that became possible. Before, you had to physically go and put a microphone in front of people. But with our new system that we've had since 2015, I think, it's possible to do the high-quality clips. This originally started in 2003 as a radio wire service of a sort. I would record it daily, similar to that, except it would recover the daily business of the Senate. And then we would make that available intended for rural radio stations and other more. Texas is a big state, as you may have heard, and so it's not easy to get people down here to Austin, but they still care about what goes on in the legislature and the Senate, and so we provided this service. Now, with the changing radio market, the demand for that fell out, and I transitioned into writing a daily report that goes up on our website, and then doing the radio report, which then became the podcast, once a week. We offer this every Friday, and we offer it in both English and Spanish because Texas is a very large Spanish-speaking population. We have a wonderful translator who has actually a background in radio and television, and she's excellent at voicing. She translates and voices all her own scripts, and she's excellent at it. This may be a consideration for your state. This may not be a consideration for your state. All right, so my workflow works like this. Basically my day is spent listening to committee meetings, press conferences, and our session. I record everything. When I hear an interesting clip, I note it down, and at the end of the day, I go back and I find sound and clip out the bites that I want to use. So at the end of the week, I'll have anywhere between 5 and 15 good quotes. At that point, I'll determine content. I look back over the week, decide what our most important business was that needs to be highlighted. I'll write an edited script, and then I'll record my voice. We have a sound studio with soundproofing and professional equipment, but you don't need that. In fact, the only thing I use it for is cutting my vocal track. Everything else, all the cutting and integrating of actualities, the mixing and posting, I do at my own computer at my own desk with free software. So it's not expensive and it's not difficult. So going forward, we've decided that there is demand for a podcast, and so we're going to try to promote it better, and we're going to try to increase the profile of it. The people who do listen to it like it. Our webmaster told us that every session he gets requests from people for RSS feeds, which don't exist anymore, So we are looking at putting this up on the podcast services like the ones that Apple and Audible offer. We have some unique challenges because we are a nonpartisan shop. We don't represent either side of the aisle. We represent the Texas Senate. If you listen to the podcast clip I played earlier, you notice I never said Republican or Democrat. I just so when I choose content, I have to avoid the politics of the question and focus on the actual nuts and bolts of the legislation. What is this bill going to do? How is this bill going to affect you? Should it become law? And then for the arguments, any political arguments or any arguments in favor or against it, I lean on those actualities. I cut those out and I let the members make the case via those clips. So the niche that I think I fill is that most commercial media focuses on the drama of the political process, the politics, the negotiations, who's on board, who's not. But I think that often the actual mechanics of legislation and what actually a bill does gets kind of lost. You might see one or two sentences about it, and that's it. I try to drill down into, this provision will mean that you have to pay this much more or this much less, and so on. So that's what I have. So I'll turn it back over to Gene, and I'll be happy to answer any questions later on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So we're going to ask you for another poll question here that will determine how much time we spend on our next section. And the question is, which statement most closely matches your situation? And we have 3 responses about equipment. First is, I have equipment in hand to start a podcast. 2, I need to know what kind of equipment I need to start a podcast. Or 3, it's too early for me to start thinking about equipment. So let's take a few seconds and let your results come in. Okay, so looks like we got about nearly 50% of the people say I need to know what kind of equipment I need to start a podcast, and we've got about 38% that say I have equipment in hand to use, and about 20% say it's too early for me to start thinking about equipment. So let's go ahead and dive in then, and what I'm going to do is talk about the equipment that I use for our American states. And this will be for people who are dipping their toes into it right now, and if you just need to get started. And then I'm going to turn this back over to Richard and Ty about what they have at the Texas Senate that may be more appropriate if you have legislative or caucus or chamber support for that. So let's talk about field recorders. I use a Roland R7 Wave MP3 recorder that's about $200. Had very great success with it. But I think if I was starting out now, the reviews and everything about the Zoom ZH5 recorder for $279 is really good. You see it's got 2 microphones there so that you could do this on the fly. And actually a lot of Hollywood types use this type of recorder for their podcast. You're going to need a mixer. One I use is called a Mackie 8-channel mixer. This is to make sure that your sound goes into your recorder. You do have an option of recording directly into your computer. I tend not to do that in case the computer fails or something. So I prefer to send my recordings through a mixer, and that's how I take the phone interviews from my phone into that mixer. We have very good friends in the state of Kentucky legislature that recommend this Neewer stereo mixer, compact mini mixing console for $60, and about anything they buy and purchase I can recommend. You're going to need headphones. These Bose Quiet Comfort 25 headphones are the ones that I use and just really love, but that is largely preference. Now, probably the biggest thing is what kind of editing software you want to use. I'd say if you're just starting out and you want something that is simple, then Audacity is probably the best way for you to go. GarageBand is another option if you're a Mac user. I've chosen to do Adobe Audition because the Our American States model, I do tend to do a lot of editing, including I try to take out some uhs and different things like that. So it costs about $30 a month to get the Adobe Audition suite, which also gives you some other graphic capabilities and stuff as well. But again, this will be personal preference. I would highly recommend Adobe Audition. There's a pretty steep learning curve, but after a while, I think it's worth it. But Audacity is definitely one that many people use. So what about recording? Landlines are great. You don't get any static and stuff, but it's hard to find interview guests that have their own landline. So I have been using this app called Voice Recorder that I send information to my guests. I ask them to download this, record the audio on their phone at their desk, and then send it to me after the interview's over. This is a system that NPR uses quite often, and it's worked very well for me. But you can also use things like Skype, Uber Conference, CallNote. They're all worth exploring. They do tend to have a fee with them if you use them for podcast recording. But those are some options that are available to you. Nothing is more important to me than sound quality. I use this Heil PR40 microphone to get the cable, stand, and everything you need. It's about $700, so it's an investment, but the quality of the sound is really good. The other ones that I would recommend, if that's too high for your price point, is a Blue Yeti USB microphone at about $125 before you buy your cords and things like that. You also need to be aware of hosting services. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but the top three are the places that you really want to make sure that you're on. But if you need someone, if your legislature, your caucus, or your chamber cannot host the information that you put on, then those other sources there are available to you if you just need to do something where you don't have a large server. So let me turn it over again to my friends in the Senate who can give you a better idea of what the legislature is capable of doing.
Hi, everybody. This is Ty. I'm the sound engineer for the Texas Senate. Now, I do all audio. I'm not like Richard, who does mainly writing. So since I'm the audio guy, I actually helped him get the podcast set up. He used to record it by himself, and then a few years ago, we implemented using a more serious setup. And as he mentioned, we have a recording room that's soundproofed. And if you're going to do any recording yourself, I would highly recommend a room that has soundproofing. If you don't have the ability to get soundproofing tiles or foam, even a broom closet, some blankets, just any way you can dampen noise or make sure that you're in a room that doesn't have a lot of echo. Now, we use an iMac, and that's mainly because the audio software we use requires an iMac. We use Logic Pro X, which is one of dozens of different audio software that's out there. The two big players in terms of audio engineering are going to be Logic Pro X and then Pro Tools. Logic Pro X you can get for $199 through the iTunes App Store, but Pro Tools is going to be a lot more costly, and the workflow isn't any easier. Audacity is free. That's a great one. Adobe Audition is also great. We just like using Logic Pro X. It's basically, if you have ever used GarageBand on an iMac, Logic Pro X is the upgraded version of that. And I find that it's really easy to use, and it also has a lot of built-in effects for sound design. So if you start getting into podcasting, you're not just going to be thinking about recording your voice and getting actualities or quotes. You also want to think about an intro and outro music. We've created our own. I just used Logic Pro X to create the music that we have as an intro and outro. We have a Shure SM7B is the microphone that Richard uses whenever he has to record anything. And as he mentioned, he'll basically come in and use the sound room to record whatever he needs to record. Then he does most everything else at his desk. And I've created a template in Logic Pro X, and that's what I would also highly recommend is, you know, say you're not the greatest sound engineer, find somebody that can help create a template that has your intro, your outro, a couple of different tracks for your voice, a track for different quotes, and, you know, not to get too heavy into it, but you'll also want to kind of learn what sounds good, but I don't want to get too far on that just yet. I have handheld recorders listed. We use both Marantz and Zoom. The handheld recorder that Gene recommended is a great handheld recorder, and we always bounce to MP3. If you have a server that can handle it, of course, WAV is going to sound better, but if you can get an MP3 out, that's what mostly everybody listens to nowadays, so I wouldn't stress too much on that. And let's see on the next slide here. As I had said, you know, audio is it starts with your ears, so anything you record, you want to make sure it starts off clean, because if you have a distortion anywhere in your audio, you can't fix that. But if your audio is low, you can always gain that up in post, and post is basically, you know, making the edits after you've already recorded it. And I put ears over eyes because while you are going to be using a visual system when you're using whatever audio software you use, you always want to make sure that it sounds good over just looking good. Like, oh, it's not peaking anywhere visually, but you also want to listen to it. Training, I think training is one of those things that you just have to do over and over again to get top quality. I put NPR's training website on here because I think that it's overall the best source for podcasting, because they do the producing side of it. So, you know, the audio, the mixing, making sure you know how to get good audio from location to your recorders, to your audio software, and then bouncing it out to the end user. They also give you a lot of tips for storytelling. Now, like Richard mentioned, we really can't get too deep into storytelling. We have to be pretty non-biased. But if you're able to have more creativeness with your podcast, that website can really help you. And then also a big part about podcasting is if you want a big audience, you have to think big with social media. And they have a lot of tips on how to spread your word, you know, spread your name through social media. And then another big part of it, while podcasting is an audio-related entity, you need a good graphic designer that can get you a good logo, help your website look good, and that's really the main tips that you can get from that website. But it's pretty comprehensive, and if I could give you any tips moving forward, it's, you know, create a template. Once you have a template, then it's really easy for whoever the individual is that's going to be hosting the podcast to just go in there, lay their tracks down. You know, Gene mentioned earlier on slide 8 about the different types of podcasting, top podcasts. Right now, the top podcasts are news, education, and comedy. So the top 2, news and education, are going to be what probably everyone listening to this is going to want to pick as their topic, is news and education. And then lastly, just make sure that any problems you have, you address them before you have a hard recording. You know, don't have it too compressed. Make sure that any breaths are cut out at the beginning and ending of a segment. You don't want to have somebody take a deep breath and that's how the podcast starts. And that's pretty much all I have on my end. I'm mainly doing audio for the Senate chamber and the committee rooms or any live stuff we do, but I have helped Richard set up the podcast. Moving forward, we're going to try to make it a little more organized. Right now, it's just kind of one topic. We're going to see if we can add some more to our podcast, maybe change the intro, maybe try to get on more outlets, but we're going to see where we go from there. And that's pretty much all I have, guys.
All right, thank you very much, Ty. As we wind down here, we wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for your questions, so I remind you to put any questions you have in the chat box down in the right-hand lower part of your screen. I've got some resources here. The NPR information that Ty presented to you is excellent. These are other podcast articles that I have listened to over time and read, and I highly recommend them all. And there again, I want to remind you of the resources tab that is in the top right portion of your just above the presentation, and we've got lots of resources there that Jane Andrade at NCSL has graciously put together. Many of them from the Links conference that some of you may have been to, but all that is there for your use as well. So we would like to get to our questions now. The first one that's come in is, how do you pick your topics? Let me say that here at NCSL, as I noted earlier, we've done 50 episodes, which has been over about a 2-year period. They actually have an editorial board here so that people get together, they know what's going on in the organization, they know what the hot topics are, they know where the information requests are coming from. So all that is taken into consideration as we try to address some of the key policy issues. But again, this being Legislative Staff Week, the podcast that went up today is a presentation on the art of persuasion that was definitely given with legislative staff in mind. So they try to not only address policy issues, but also things that can help people in their job and their careers. Richard and Ty, do you want to tell us how you go about in Texas determining what your topics are?
Sure, no problem. Like I said earlier, we are a nonpartisan shop, and so we have to so basically I just focus on the business of the Senate. And I've been doing this for 16 years, so I have a good sense of what legislation is important and what I mean, it's all important, of course, but what is the big state impact legislation, and then I try to pick that. I'll often focus on more rural issues that come up, mainly because I feel that the big, like Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, El Paso, they have commercial stations that cover those regions fairly extensively. So if I have if there's a bill that will impact people in the rural areas, I try to highlight that if it comes down to a question of cutting it for this or that. But usually, like for the budget, for our big bills, those are the ones that I select for the week in review. Mostly, it's going to be anything to do with taxes, anything to do with education, and transportation. Anything that affects how people drive is going to get a lot of response because especially in Texas, everyone drives everywhere. And so, if we had a texting ban come through this year or in 2017, that's something that's going to affect every single person in the state, regardless of where they live. So I made sure to highlight that piece. But you have to know your state, you have to know your audience, and you have to know what they're looking for. And that's how I select content.
Oh, great. Richard and Ty, I forget, one of you had mentioned about RSS feeds, and I think you had a throwaway line there about they don't exist anymore. We have someone that says they've been adding them to their website all year. Can you clarify the RSS feed statement?
I guess we don't do it. I guess I just misunderstood our webmaster when he was talking about it. But, yeah, that was just a throwaway. If I'm wrong, then I'm sorry.
Okay. So we got a couple other questions for you. How long is your podcast?
It ranges between 4 and 6 minutes. I feel that having a consistent length is important, but also with the podcast, as opposed to the actual daily stories that I write, which have to, I have to consider things like column inches, I get a little more room to go along if I need to highlight things, and also because there isn't a daily report for the podcast, I have to fit more in. So 4 to 6 minutes.
Okay, and then they want another person wants to know if the Texas legislature has a communications department that puts this together.
We do not have a communications department. We have our office, I suppose, Texas Senate Media Services.
All inclusive.
But we serve all 31 members and the lieutenant governor. We don't have. I understand that in some states it's done by caucus, but here it's done centralized. We do photo, we do all our broadcasting of committees and session and other events. All our web stuff is done through our office. The one who puts it together is me. Like I said, my job is to listen to and basically hours and hours of official proceedings and then digest that down. So I guess the comms department that puts it together is me.
Okay. Remind everyone that if you have other questions, put them in the chat box. We've got others to get to here. One is anyone using Alexa for distribution? I will say that I am looking at that for NCSL. I've got an Echo at home and listen to quite a few podcasts from newspapers and radio stations across the country. And my understanding is that pretty much anybody can put up information that people can subscribe to and listen to on Alexa. I'm not aware of any legislature or legislator or chamber or caucus doing that right now, but I think it's something that definitely people should keep an eye out for. And Richard and Ty, I don't know if you have any knowledge about that.
No, we unfortunately aren't on Alexa, but that mainly comes down to the fact that we aren't on any podcasting apps or websites. The only way to find our podcast is if you go to the Texas Senate website. But the cool thing about Alexa is once you can get on Audible or any other podcast app that Alexa supports, then you can be on the Alexa and, be anywhere in your house and say, I want to listen to the Texas Senate, and then it just starts playing. So, but currently, no, we're not on the Alexa or any other podcasting services.
But I think it's definitely something that people will be going to here in the future. Another person asked if they can get a copy of the presentation for reference. Again, I will reference that resources tab just on top of the presentation there. And I think that will be ready sometime soon. Yeah, there will be a recording of this available sometime within a week, and you should be getting a notice about that when it is ready. Let me throw out a couple of services here that people have mentioned that I'm not familiar with, but perhaps our friends in Texas are. Services called Anchor or Buzzsprout. Does that ring a bell with either of you?
Yeah, so both of them are kind of like all-inclusive podcasting locations, and I believe the microcasting with Anchor is basically what it sounds like. But as I had mentioned, we're only on our own website. I think that moving forward, if we can get on some of the big podcasting apps, we would do that. But Buzzsprout is more of like an all-inclusive hosting, marketing, kind of like a recording platform. There's a few websites like that kind of include everything in one site, and some of them will even have where you can record or, call somebody else that you want to record on the other end that you're going to interview. But I really would highly recommend that they, get their own audio software and then just try to get it hosted on one of the big podcasting apps. Some of those websites are great and they're fine, and some people find success, but I feel like over the long term, if you want to grow, it would be in your best interest to learn some of the more difficult aspects, I guess you would say, instead of just relying on using a single all-included package. But, you know, I know that some legislatures, they're only given so much money, so, you know, if that's the way you want to go, then it wouldn't hurt. I mean, if you got to get your voice out there, and by any means necessary, I would say give it a shot. But
Okay, and a reminder that we are available till the top of the hour, so if you have more questions, please put them in that chat window. We've got a question on any marketing tips, and let me kind of start off with that one, and kind of relates to how you build your audience. One of the things you have to remember about this is that it's the old flywheel, that, you know, it's hard to get this started, but as you get started, it gets easier to push the flywheel and have success with this. So for our American states, we had a built-in audience for legislators and legislative staff. So I think identifying who your audience is going to be, if it's going to be a statewide audience, then you're going to, and I'm assuming that you're wanting to use public relations tactics here, things that generate free media. But as we are finding out, as all of you know, as someone, again, who worked in the Missouri legislature years and years ago, the number of media that are covering legislatures is way down. So you essentially have to create your own newsroom. And again, this is to get information just directly to the people. I think it's a sad situation, but that is the world that we live in today. So in terms of marketing, coming up with that great name, coming up with that great URL, coming up with the design of your logo, all that stuff is very critical at the start, because you want to look professional. And once people start finding you, you want them to be able to know that this is a place that they want to hang their hat. I really recommend going to the iTunes store and seeing what's popular. I think Ty mentioned earlier about news and education. There's also a government category there. Look at those and see what types of names and what types of logos that they are using, and that's really going to be critical. But it's like anything else; you just have to push the information out there, and you have to figure out a way to grow an audience. And depending on whether you're doing this for a legislature, a caucus, a chamber, you have to have those people who are involved there helping you out and help spreading the word, maybe even making up business cards or some kind of card or something that they can leave when they're doing presentations all across the state. So having materials available to you, people will pick those up, and they will go to the website and locate you and find you. But again, I think looking professional is probably one of the best things to do. Richard or Ty, would you like to add to any marketing tips?
Yeah, I mean, really, as we've stated, both of us multiple times, our podcast is just on our site, so there's not much marketing we can do. But when we're given the opportunity, the biggest thing, especially with people under 40 or even older people, is social media. I mean, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat. Of course, a good URL, a good website, something that's very clean is very helpful. But if you can get a social media presence, I think that does more for marketing than anything else. And, you got to kind of stay consistent with it. A tweet every couple of weeks isn't really going to do it. You really have to get your presence out there and known. And then if you can get big names on whatever social media platform, whether it's Twitter or Instagram, to throw you a mention, that can really build up your market as well. And one thing that they do in the podcast industry is they will get, like, say that, me and Richard are up and coming in the podcast industry. Well, we'll find somebody that's already established and try to interview them or see if they'll interview us. So that way we can pull in some of their listeners and vice versa. So that's another idea that you could use. But, we kind of have to wait and see before we get to the 2019 session before we can see how far we can take that. But those are my tips.
Thank you. We have a question here that says, we do not have a podcast for our state legislature. Do you have any ideas, tips, in regards to convincing the powers that be how beneficial a podcast would be? That's an excellent question. I think that a lot of people can relate to. A lot of the statistics that I had at the top of this webinar, I think, would be useful. And finding ones where whatever, if it's your legislature, then, pointing to people like Texas, I think is good, and showing what they're doing, and you saw the number of responses that they're getting and how many downloads and listeners that they're having. So I really think it's those types of statistics that really help to sell this. I know in my former position as a communications director in Missouri that having to write those memos, that it really was the statistics, that it was a data-driven decision that seemed to be most important to them. That really the emotion of it wasn't so great, but how to quantify the time that you spent and what kind of benefit that you're going to get out of it. But again, I would really point to the fact that this is trending and that even millennials are really starting to listen to podcasts more and how important the smartphone is. So take a lot of those statistics. There are plenty more out there in the resources that I've put out there and Jane has put up for you here. And what about in Texas, guys? What has helped you?
Well, the biggest thing I would mention is that less and less people are listening to radio, and a lot of people, if they're not moving to an app-based radio or, just listening to music straight on Spotify, they're listening more to podcasts. The statistics you mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you show how podcasting is trending upwards. And Richard, it's funny enough I mentioned radio to podcasting. Richard began recording actualities and then sending them to radio stations. Well, he no longer does that, and now he just has our podcast on our website. And that's kind of the future. If your legislature needs a trend, they can easily go into Google and type in Amazon podcasting or Google podcasting. Both Amazon and Google are investing a lot of money into how to grow podcasts, how they can make a profit off of it. And it's really going to be the future of radio personalities. And a lot of radio stations are now live streaming all of their radio shows and then turning that live stream after it's over into a podcast. And you can just see the amount of money. If you just type into Google the future of podcasting, there are dozens and dozens of directions that people are trying to take podcasts. And there's kind of a problem where everyone's not sure how to attract viewers the best way, but that's kind of a good thing because if you get in early, whichever way the market goes, you're ready to go with the market.
My only advice would be don't just pitch it as we need a podcast. Come up with an idea for what you want to do with your podcast first. And even if you can, because while, you can definitely have a setup like ours, you can do a podcast with a phone and a mic. So if you wanted to cut a demo one, you could do that. And you show up at whoever would approve it with the finished product, and you can show them why it's, how it sounds, what you plan to do. But also it's good transparency. If you're a nonpartisan outlet like us, I don't know of a politician in America that doesn't say that they want more transparency and sunlight on the process. And so that's just a great way. I mean, even one person listening to it is learning about state government. I mean, obviously, that's probably not cost effective. You probably want to shoot a little higher than that. But as far as a way to reach, a way for the legislature to engage with the public, podcasting is a rapidly increasing vector for that. Excellent.
And we have another question that's kind of related to that, and it's, have you been a guest on other podcasts? The answer for me is no. but it is something that we are looking at, and it's really actually a great marketing tool to get to exchange being a guest on other people's podcasts, so that you're helping grow their audience and they're helping you grow your audience. So I think that's something that you want to probably put into your marketing strategy, to find similar podcasts that would be that might be open to that type of relationship. What about you guys?
Oh, no, I've never, one, I'm not a podcasting personality, as it were. As you may have noticed, I'm doing basically a traditional radio report. So, also there's as a state employee, getting state money, I'm not really going to go on a podcast and, I'm happy to do something like this and talk about making podcasts, but as far as talking about, government and giving analysis or not, that's a little outside my, that's a little above my pay grade.
Okay. We are nearing the end of our hour here. We've put our email addresses up there. If you have a question for any of us, we're happy to take that and respond to you. We have one more comment. A person would like to recommend Zencastr as a great service for interviews. He says it uses VoIP, so everyone can hear each other, but the audio records directly to your computer and uploads every 30 seconds, so you don't lose much if your computer crashes. So that's another recommendation from one of our participants today. So that looks like we've reached the end of the line for our questions and our time allotted today. We really appreciate everyone being part of this podcast, and again, you'll be contacted when we have the video recording available. So I'll turn it over to my friends in Texas for any final thoughts.
You have our email. We are happy to help anybody with this, getting started, or any tips or advice we can offer. We are happy to give, and thanks for having us.
Yep,
and
whether it's
good
audio or production related.
Yep. So good luck in your respective sessions, everyone.
Yes, so we hope this has been helpful, and I think if we know that we've kind of glazed over a lot of important topics, and perhaps if you think NCSL should dive into any of these topics, let them know that you'd like a further webinar on around this subject, and maybe dive a little bit deeper into something. So thank you, everyone, for being online, and good luck.